Imagine the dense ancient canopy of the Black Forest in southern Germany, where sunlight struggles to pierce the thicket of firs and pines, casting long shadows that seem to move on their own. It's a place steeped in folklore, tales of witches, werewolves, and wandering spirits whispered by locals for centuries. But what if those shadows aren't just tricks of the light? What if they form ranks, marching silently through the night, echoing battles long forgotten? In the modern era, the U.S. military maintains a presence in Germany, a holdover from Cold War alliances and NATO commitments. Bases like Ramstein and Stuttgart house thousands of service members, but smaller outposts dot the landscape for training exercises and rapid response. One such site is Forward Operating Base Schwarzwald, a modest Marine Corps installation nestled on the edge of the Black Forest near Freiburg. Established in the early 2000s for joint exercises with Bundeswehr forces, it's a no-frills compound. Razor wire fences, Quonset huts, and aging barracks repurposed from old German military structures dating back to World War II. Historical records confirm the area saw fierce fighting in 1945, Allied forces clashing with Wehrmacht remnants in the fog-shrouded woods. Mass graves were unearthed during construction, but the Pentagon pressed on, citing strategic necessity. I've collected stories from veterans over the years, and this one comes from a squad of Marines deployed there in 2023 for a routine training rotation. They were Echo Company, a 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, battle-hardened from tours in Afghanistan and Syria. What they encountered wasn't an enemy insurgent or a training mishap. It was something that defied explanation, a shadow army haunting the barracks, manifesting in whispers, apparitions, and an overwhelming sense of dread. These aren't campfire tales. They're corroborated accounts from NCOs and enlisted alike, logged in after-action reports that were quietly buried. As we delve into their testimonies, ask yourself, in the dead of night, when the forest whispers secrets, could the past refuse to stay buried? Could luck be the only thing standing between survival and joining those shadows? Let's step into the Schwarzwald barracks and hear what these Marines endured. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Whispering Barracks. My name is Sergeant Marcus Hale, Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. In the winter of 2023, we rotated into Forward Operating Base Schwarzwald, a forgotten little outpost pressed up against the edge of Germany's Black Forest, like it was trying to hide from the trees. The base sat in a shallow valley where the pines grew so thick the sun only reached the ground in thin, pale blades. From the moment our convoy rolled through the gate, the place felt wrong, like stepping into a room where an argument had just ended and everyone was pretending nothing happened. Barracks 3 was ours. It was a long 2-story concrete box left over from the cold. War, maybe older, faded green paint peeled off in strips, and the windows were the narrow kind that make you feel watched, even when you're the only one looking out. Inside smelled of old bleach, mildew, and something metallic that clung to the back of your throat. The bunks were the same olive-drab steel racks I'd slept in since Pendleton, but here the frames creaked without anyone touching them, like the building itself was restless. We dropped our sea bags and started claiming racks. I took the lower one nearest the door, squad leader habit, always between my Marines and whatever might come through it. Jenkins, our 19-year-old boot with cheeks still fighting acne, got stuck with the top bunk over Diaz because he was slowest off the truck. Ramirez, our saw gunner built like a refrigerator, started bitching immediately about the mattress being thinner than an MRE cracker. Normal squad noise. It should have felt like home. It didn't. While we unpacked, I walked the halls to get the layout. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, some flickering like they couldn't decide whether to stay lit. Every corridor looked identical, chipped tile floors, rows of dented lockers, and doors that didn't quite close flush. On the second deck, I found a storage room nobody had opened in years. Dust lay so thick it looked like gray snow, and in the middle of the floor, someone had scratched a crude circle of runes with what must have been a bayonet. Underneath, in faded black paint, were the words Schatten marschieren, Shadows March. I took a picture, told myself it was leftover Cold War psyop nonsense, and kept moving. That first evening, we had a quick brief from Captain Reyes in the chow hall. Standard stuff. No fraternization with locals. No wandering into the forest after dark. Respect the training schedule with the Bundeswehr. He ended with a half-joke about old-timers on base apparently loved. "The Schwarzwald has ears, gentlemen. Don't give it anything to listen to." A couple guys chuckled. I didn't. Night came fast. By 1900, the forest swallowed the last of the light, and the temperature dropped hard. We cranked the wall heaters until they glowed orange, but the cold still found ways in. I set the fire watch roster and turned in early, figuring jet lag would knock me out. It almost did. Around Odro 200, I woke to the sound of movement in the corridor. Slow, deliberate footsteps, too heavy for one Marine doing rounds. I sat up, reached for my M18 under the pillow, and listened. The steps kept perfect interval, like someone pacing off a parade deck, but there was no squeak of boots on tile, no breathing, nothing human about it. They passed my door, continued down the hall, and stopped right outside the squad bay. Silence. Then the footsteps started again, only now they were coming back, and there were more of them. I slipped out of my rack and padded to the door in socks. When I cracked it, the hallway was empty. The emergency exit sign cast a dull red glow, but every shadow stretched farther than it should have, pooling in the corners like spilled oil. I smelled ozone and wet earth. For a second, I thought I saw shapes inside that darkness. Tall, thin, helmets high and angular, rifles slung muzzle down the old European way. Then the overhead light snapped on by itself, and everything was normal again. Just flickering fluorescence and cold concrete. I checked on Jenkins, who had the 0200 FO400 watch. Found him sitting on an ammo crate by the main entrance, staring out the wire toward the tree line. His knuckles were white on his M4. "You good, Private?" He didn't look at me right away. "They're out there, Sarge. Whole formation of them. No moon, no nods, but I can see them plain as day. Just standing at the edge of the trees, waiting." I followed his gaze. Nothing but black trunks and drifting mist. Could be deer, could be Bundeswehr running a night movement. They ain't deer, and they ain't breathing. I told him to stay sharp, logged the time in the watchbook, and went back to my rack. But I left my boots on. Something about the way the building settled, the way the air tasted, told me this rotation wasn't going to be about cold weather drills and bratwurst with the Germans. Before dawn, the whispers started. Low at first, like wind through a cracked window, then clearer, overlapping voices speaking German none of us should have understood, but somehow did. Vorwärts. Immer vorwärts, forward, always forward. We hadn't even been on ground 24 hours, and the barracks were already talking back. Chapter 2. The First Manifestation. This is Corporal Elena Diaz, Assistant Squad Leader, Fire Team Bravo. I've slept in burned-out schools in Fallujah, in shipping containers in Syria, in mud holes that smelled like death. I thought I knew what a bad billet felt like. Barracks 3 taught me I didn't know anything. 3 nights after we moved in, the building stopped pretending to be normal. I had the 2400-0200 fire watch. Hale had doubled the roster after Jenkins's tree line story, so it was just me and the quiet. I walked the corridor slow, boots soft on the tile, flashlight under my rifle like we'd done 1,000 times in hostile towns. The air was colder than the thermostat said it should be. Every breath came out in a white plume that hung too long before disappearing. On my third lap, I noticed the emergency exit at the far end of the second deck was cracked open. Not wide, just enough for a finger of fog to crawl in. SOP says secure all exterior doors. I moved to close it. That's when the lights cut out. Total black. Not the soft dark you get with NVGs. This was the kind of dark that presses on your eyeballs. My weapon light snapped on automatically, cutting a white tunnel down the hall. Empty. But the temperature plummeted so fast, the metal of my rifle burned cold against my gloves. Then I saw them. At first, just movement in the beam. Like heat. Shimmer on asphalt. Then the shimmer thickened, folded in on itself, and became men stepped out of nothing. Tall, thin silhouettes wearing long coats and those old coal scuttle helmets. No faces, just black where faces should have been. Rifles held at high port the way Germans carried them in every grainy newsreel I'd ever seen. They formed a perfect single file down the center of the corridor, boots making no sound on the tile. I brought my rifle up, red dot steady. Halt! Identifizieren Sie sich. Nothing. They kept coming, slow, deliberate, spacing exact. My heartbeat hammered in my ears so loud, I almost missed the whisper that slid past my ear. Angriffsbefehl. Vorwärts. I keyed my radio. Sarge Diaz, hallway second deck, multiple unidentified inside the wire. Need the QRF now. Hale's voice came back calm but tight. Copy, weapons tight. Do not engage unless fired upon. On the way. The line stopped 10 feet from me. The lead shadow tilted its head, as if listening to orders only it could hear. Then, in perfect unison, every figure raised its right arm in a straight salute that ended with a fist over the heart. Old-style Wehrmacht. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some prank with thermal blankets and night vision goggles. These things had no heat signature at all. Behind me, the squad bay door banged open. Hale, Ramirez, and Jenkins spilled out in skivvy shirts and armor, weapons up. The shadows pivoted as one toward the noise, then began advancing again. Faster. The air turned arctic. Frost spider-webbed across the walls in seconds. Back! Hale barked. We retreated toward the stairwell, rifles tracking targets that didn't flinch when red dots danced across their chests. Ramirez let off a 3-round burst into the ceiling, standard warning in a confined space. Plaster rained down, but the shadows flowed through it like smoke through a screen. They reached the spot where I'd been standing. The lead figure paused, lowered its arm, and pointed directly at Jenkins. The kid's eyes went wide. "They know my name," he whispered. "They just said my name." I didn't hear anything, but Jenkins dropped his rifle and clapped hands over his ears like someone had screamed inside his skull. Hale grabbed his drag strap and hauled him backward. We piled down the stairs, boots clanging, shadows gliding after us without hurry, without sound. We hit the ground floor and slammed the heavy fire door. Ramirez threw the deadbolt while Hale slapped a fresh magazine home. For 10 long seconds we waited, rifles aimed up the stairwell. Nothing came through. No footsteps, no breathing, no metallic clatter of old Mausers, just the smell of wet earth and gun oil that didn't belong to any of us. Then, the lights flickered back on, harsh and buzzing. Frost melted off the walls and rivulets. My radio crackled with the duty NCO asking why we'd fired a weapon inside the building. Hale looked at each of us, eyes hard. Mass. Hallucination from bad ventilation, he said into the handset, voice flat. Situation under control. We knew it was a lie. The shadows hadn't followed us downstairs. They didn't need to. They were already everywhere else. That morning, we found the frost patterns on the second deck, spelled words in old German script across the floor. Bleib bei uns. Stay with us. The barracks had introduced themselves. They weren't finished talking. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Past. Lance Corporal Thomas Ramirez, Echo Company Saw Gunner. I'm the guy who carries the pig, the M249, so I'm used to being the loudest thing in any room. In Barracks 3, the loudest thing wasn't me anymore. It was the dead. After Diaz's hallway encounter, we tried every rational fix. Maintenance ran carbon monoxide checks, came back clean. The doc handed out melatonin like candy. The chaplain swung by with holy water and a half-hearted blessing that smelled like cheap incense. Nothing changed the fact that every night the building got colder, darker, and angrier. I started sleeping with my saw across my chest like a teddy bear. Dumb, yeah, but the weight of it kept me calm. One night, I woke up because the weight was gone. The weapon was still there, strap cutting into my collarbone, yet it felt like nothing at all, like the steel had turned to black ice. I blinked, and the rack above me was empty. Jenkins usually slept there, except Jenkins was standing at the foot of my bunk, eyes open, arms hanging straight down. Moonlight from the window painted him silver. "Boot, you good?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He just pivoted, perfect about face, and started walking toward the squad bay door. Slow, measured steps, heels barely lifting. Every other Marine in the room was still in their racks, breathing steady, but Jenkins moved like someone had wound him up and pointed him. I rolled out, barefoot on freezing tile, and followed. He went down the hallway we'd all started avoiding after dark, past the frost words that never quite melted. I kept 10 feet back, finger indexed along the frame of my sidearm. He stopped at the old storage room with the scratched circle, the one Hale had photographed. The door was open. I know we'd locked it. Inside, the rest of them waited. Not my squad. Them. 2 perfect ranks of shadow soldiers, maybe 30 strong, standing at ease inside the tiny room that couldn't possibly hold that many bodies. Helmets high and angular, greatcoats hanging off frames too thin to be alive. Their rifles were grounded, muzzles in that same circle of runes. Jenkins walked straight between the ranks like he'd rehearsed it his whole life, turned, and took his place at the rear, as if the spot had always been his. The lead shadow, taller, with a darker officer's cap, raised one hand. Every figure snapped to attention. Boots didn't hit the floor, but the concussion rolled through my chest like a breaching charge. Then they began to sing, not with mouths, with the air itself. A low marching cadence, German words I didn't know but felt in my bones. Erica, Rika, Rika, Erica. I backed out slow, eased the door shut, and ran. I hit the squad bay, screaming for Hale. Lights snapped on. Everyone came up swinging. Took 3 of us to keep Jenkins from walking out again. He fought like a man sleepwalking into the ocean. When he finally snapped out of it, he had no memory, just bruises on his wrists shaped like long, thin fingers. Next morning, we dragged the base historian back. Old German guy, nervous eyes, showed him pictures of the circle, the frost writing. He went pale. That is a Blutkreis, he said. Blood circle. SS unit stationed here in 44 called itself Sturmabteilung Schwarzwald. They made a pact. If the Reich fell, they would keep marching until the fatherland rose again. Allied artillery hit them during a ritual. Whole company gone in seconds. The circle bound them to this ground. He pointed at the photo of Jenkins standing in ranks. They are recruiting replacements. 1 living soul for every fallen man. When the circle is full again, they march out of the forest for good. We laughed him off in front of the CO, but that night we moved every rack into the center of the squad bay, formed a wagon wheel defense like we were expecting Hajis with RPGs. Hale posted 2-man watches, loaded magazines, fixed bayonets. We even dragged in road flares and chem lights until the room looked like a rave. Didn't matter. At some point, the flares guttered out all at once. The chem lights dimmed to red embers. Then the walls started breathing. Slow, rhythmic, like lungs the size of the building. Shadows peeled off the ceiling and dropped into formation around our little island of bunks. 30, 40, 50 of them. More appearing every second. The tall officer stepped forward and spoke with a voice that wasn't sound. Ein Freiwilliger. 1 volunteer. Jenkins started to stand again. I tackled him. Diaz sat on his chest. Hale leveled his rifle at empty air and roared, "Not one of mine, you dead bastards!" The shadows tilted their heads, listening. Then they advanced. We opened fire. Tracers stitched red lines through bodies that weren't there, brass tinkling on tile like bells. The officer raised his hand, and every round froze midair, hung spinning, then dropped harmless to the floor. Cold like I've never felt clamped down. My breath crystallized and fell as snow. The shadows closed the circle. And that was the night we learned bullets don't kill what's already dead. Chapter 4. The siege begins. Private First Class, Liam Jenkins. Yeah, the boot. The one who got singled out. After the night Ramirez dragged me back from the blood circle, the shadows stopped pretending to be subtle. They declared war on us, and the barracks became the battlefield. We tried to stay awake 24 hours a day, but you can't outrun sleep forever. When it finally took me, they were waiting. I opened my eyes inside a dream that wasn't a dream. I was standing in perfect ranks with them, greatcoat hanging off me like it had been tailored in hell, helmet pressing cold iron against my skull. My hands, not my hands, worked the bolt of a Kar 90D8K slick with frost. The tall officer walked the line, stopping in front of each man, touching the brim of his cap. When he reached me, he leaned in close. No face, just a hole full of night, and a voice that scraped across my brain. Du gehörst jetzt uns. You belong to us now. I woke up screaming. My rack was empty, sheets soaked with sweat that froze solid the instant it hit the air. The squad bay was dark except for the red exit sign. Every other Marine was still asleep, but their shadows on the walls were standing at attention, rifles raised, separate from the bodies that owned them. That was the first night of the siege. They didn't try to take just one of us anymore. They wanted the whole squad. Lights refused to stay on longer than 30 seconds. Doors slammed in perfect sequence down the hallway like a giant invisible cadet company doing room inspection. The temperature dropped so low, the metal bunks rang like gongs when we touched them. Frost crawled across the ceiling in the shape of spread-eagled swastikas that melted into screaming faces and reformed again. We formed a tight perimeter in the center of the squad bay, backs together, weapons out. Hale had us stack every piece of furniture against the doors, but the shadows came through the vents, slid under the cracks, poured out of the electrical outlets like black mercury. Whenever one got close enough to touch, it felt like sticking your hand into liquid nitrogen while someone whispered every doubt you ever had about yourself straight into your soul. Ramirez tried to lay down hate with the saw. The belt fed fine, brass flew, muzzle flash lit the room like strobes, but every round passed through them and buried itself in the far wall. The shadows soaked up the light and grew darker. Diaz started reciting the Lord's Prayer in Spanish at the top of her lungs. The words came out backwards and made the shadows laugh, a sound like tank treads on gravel. They herded us. That's the only word for it. They pushed from every corridor, every stairwell, forcing us tighter and tighter until we were shoulder to shoulder in the common area. The tall officer appeared in the middle of the room. No door, no footstep, just there. He raised both arms, and every shadow snapped to present arms. The temperature bottomed out so hard my eyelids stuck together when I blinked. He spoke again, and this time we all heard it the same. Einer für alle. One for all. Hale stepped forward, rifle up. You want to volunteer? Take me. Leave my Marines alone. The officer tilted his head, considering. Then the shadows rushed in from every direction at once, a black tide with no splash, no sound. I saw Hale disappear under them first, then Diaz, then Ramirez swinging the saw like a club until it was ripped out of his hands. I tried to run and hit a wall that hadn't been there a second ago. Cold fingers closed around my throat, not squeezing, just holding, claiming. I felt myself being pulled backward into the wall, into the concrete itself, like it had turned to tar. My boots left the floor. The last thing I saw with my own eyes was the officer saluting me with my own hand. Then everything went white. I came to on the freezing tile with the squad slapping my face and pouring coffee down my throat. I'd been gone maybe 4 seconds, but it felt like years. My dog tags were twisted backward and ice cold against my chest. When I looked in the mirror later, there was a perfect black handprint on the back of my neck that no amount of scrubbing would remove. We realized the rules that night. They couldn't drag us all the way through at once. They needed us willing or broken or alone. So they settled in to wait, to wear us down, to make us choose the dark because the light hurt too much. The siege had begun, and the barracks were no longer a building. They were a mouth, and we were already halfway down the throat. Chapter 5. Desperate Measures. Sergeant Marcus Hale again. By this point, we were running on caffeine, hate, and the kind of fear that stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like gravity. The shadows had turned Barracks 3 into a kill box with no enemy to shoot back shoot. We had to change the game, or we were going to disappear one by one. We started with everything the Corps ever taught us about holding a structure. Ramirez welded the stairwell doors shut using the maintenance oxyacetylene rig. Diaz ran det cord across every interior doorway and wired it to clacker style so we could collapse the corridors if they massed. I had Jenkins rig every chemlight and road flare we owned into tripwire booby traps. We turned the squad bay into an Alamo of concertina wire, sandbags, and prayer. Looked like Fallujah all over again, except the insurgents were already inside the wire and didn't bleed. It bought us 6 hours. Then the tall officer simply stepped through the welded steel like it was fog and stood in the middle of our fortress. He didn't speak this time. He just opened his hand and every flare guttered out at once. The det cord turned to black ice and shattered. The shadows followed him in, slow and polite, the way a hangman walks to the scaffold. That was when we went off script. I remembered the old German historian muttering something about binding requires consent. I didn't know if it was bullshit, but it was the only card we had left. I ordered the squad to strip every religious item we owned, crucifixes, St. Michael medals, even the tiny Quran one of our attached Navy Corvin carried, and nail them to the walls in a rough circle around our position. Diaz poured the last of her Abuela's Florida water in a ring around us. Ramirez, raised Catholic, but lapsed hard, started reciting the only Latin he still knew from 12 years of midnight mass. Jenkins just cried and held his rifle like it could still save him. The shadows hesitated at the edge of the circle. Not much, just enough for me to see a chance. I took it. I stepped out alone. The cold hit like jumping into the Arctic. Every shadow turned toward me at once, hungry. I walked straight to the officer until the brim of his helmet almost touched my forehead. Then I did the only thing left that might piss off the dead more than the living. I laughed in his face. "You want to volunteer?" I said, loud enough for my squad to hear. "Here I am, but I come with terms. You get me only if you beat me in a soldier's contest. One task. You win, I march with you forever. I win, you leave my Marines alone and never come back to this building." The officer considered. The air went perfectly still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. He extended one black-gloved hand. I took it. Instantly, I was somewhere else, standing on a snow-covered firing range from another century. A line of spectral soldiers waited at the 300-meter line, old Mausers on their shoulders. The officer pointed to a single round on the snow in front of me, an American .30-06 cartridge, and then to an identical one in front of him. German 8mm. The rules burned themselves into my mind. Whoever could fire 10 aimed shots and ring the steel plate downrange first would claim the soul. I picked up the cartridge. It weighed nothing and everything. We loaded. We fired. The first 9 shots were a blur. Recoil that never came. Brass that fell upward into black sky. On the 10th round, my bolt locked back empty the exact same instant his did. Dead tie. The officer stared. Then, for the first time, something like frustration rippled across the place where his face should have been. I smiled, tasting blood and cordite. "Tie goes to the defender, motherfucker. Get the hell off my objective." I slammed my hand against the steel plate. The clang echoed like a church bell across 2 wars. The range dissolved. I was back in the squad bay, on my knees, lungs burning. The shadows were recoiling, shriveling, pouring out of the room like smoke up a chimney. The officer gave me one slow, deliberate salute. Not surrender, just acknowledgement, and stepped backward into the wall. The lights came up steady for the first time in days. The frost melted. The air warmed 10 degrees in a heartbeat. We didn't cheer. We just sat there shaking, listening to the building breathe normal again. The siege was broken, but every one of us knew the fine print. I'd bought my squad with a draw, not a victory. Somewhere out in the forest, the tall officer was still waiting for the rematch. And I still owed him a 10th round. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point Corporal Elena Diaz. We thought we had won. We were wrong. For 48 hours after Hale's impossible draw, Barracks 3 stayed quiet. The lights worked. The heaters worked. The frost vanished. We even managed 4 straight hours of sleep without dreaming of helmets and marching boots. We started believing the dead had honored the deal. They were just reloading. It started small. A single dog tag found hanging from the pull-up bar in the common area. Mine, the one I'd lost in Syria 2 years earlier. Then Ramirez's Ka-bar appeared driven straight through the center of his mattress while he was in the shower. Hale's challenge coin from his first deployment turned up melted into the tile outside the latrine, still smoking. Messages, reminders. The contract wasn't broken. It had been amended. We tried to leave the building anyway. Orders came down to shift billets to a tent city the engineers were throwing up on the parade field. We packed sea bags, stacked them by the door, and waited for the duty truck that never arrived. Every time we stepped outside the threshold, the forest exhaled, a cold wind that smelled of turned earth and old blood, and pushed us back inside like a giant invisible hand. The shadows weren't letting their prize walk away. That night, they stopped asking. I was on watch when the walls started bleeding, not metaphorically, literally. Dark red seeped from the cinder blocks in slow rivulets, tracing the outline of every swastika Frost had drawn days earlier. The temperature crashed so hard the blood froze mid-drip into ruby icicles. Then the lights went out for good. No flicker, no surge, just darkness absolute. We flipped NVGs down. The world turned green and grainy, and the squad bay was full of them. Hundreds. They stood in perfect formation between the bunks, between us inside the lockers on the ceiling. Every single one faced inward toward the 4 of us huddled back to back in the center. No weapons this time. They didn't need them. The tall officer stood at the foot of my rack, cap tilted exactly 45 degrees, hands clasped behind his back like a commander inspecting troops. He spoke once, soft, almost kind. "Zeit abgelaufen." Time's up. The shadows moved. Not fast. Never fast. They simply closed the distance the way tide closes on sand. We fired everything we had left. Rifles, pistols, the last belt in the saw, even the flare gun. The rounds punched holes that sealed instantly. Flares burst against their chests and died like matches in rain. Bayonets passed through them and came out cold enough to stick to our gloves. Ramirez went down first. A dozen hands lifted him straight off the ground, gentle, almost ceremonial, and carried him toward the east wall. He didn't scream. He just looked at me with eyes already going vacant and whispered, "Tell my mom I tried." I lunged after him, grabbed his drag strap. The cold burned through my gloves and into my bones. For one heartbeat, I saw what he saw. Endless ranks marching through snow under a sky without stars, boots that never tired, a war that never ended. Then the strap snapped. Like rotted cloth, and he was gone, swallowed into the concrete like it was deep water. Jenkins broke next. He dropped his weapon, walked forward with arms outstretched, smiling like a kid meeting Santa. "It doesn't hurt," he said. "They just want us to march with them. Forever's not so bad if you're not alone." Diaz tackled him, screaming his name, but the shadows peeled her off the way you'd brush lint from a uniform. Jenkins stepped into the ranks, and the hole closed behind him. Hale and I were the last two standing. He looked at me, face gray with frostbite that hadn't been there minutes ago, and gave the smallest nod. The nod that says, "I've got you," even when we both know it's a lie. He raised his rifle, pressed the muzzle under his own chin, and pulled the trigger before I could stop him. Click. Empty. The officer caught the barrel, eased the weapon down like a father correcting a child, and shook his head once. Not yet. Then the hands took Hale, too. I was alone in the dark with an army of the dead, and the sound of my own heartbeat counting down. I ran. Not brave, not tactical, just animal panic. I hit the emergency exit at full speed, shoulder first. The door flew open into blinding floodlights and freezing air that felt like heaven after the tomb inside. I stumbled out onto the gravel, fell, rolled, came up screaming for the guard force that was supposed to be there. No one, just the barracks behind me, windows glowing soft red from inside, and the faint sound of boots marching in perfect cadence. I looked down. My shadow on the ground wasn't mine anymore. It wore a long coat and a coal scuttle helmet, and it was already turning back toward the open door. I ran into the forest, and I'd been warned never to enter, and the trees closed behind me like a gate. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was the tall officer's voice, calm and almost proud. "Willkommen bei der Schatten here, Corporal. Welcome to the Shadow Army." Chapter 7. The dawn. We didn't deserve Corporal Elena Diaz, the only one who walked out of the forest alive. I don't remember how long I ran. Branches tore my face, roots tried to drag me down, and every step echoed with boots that weren't mine. The trees whispered in German, then in English, then in voices I knew. Ramirez begging me to come back, Jenkins laughing like nothing had ever hurt him, Hale giving one last calm order, "Don't let them win, Diaz." I burst into a clearing just as the sky behind the pines turned the color of old blood. Dawn. The one thing they couldn't follow into. The shadows stopped at the tree line like they'd hit a wall. Hundreds of them, ranks deeper than I could count. Helmets high, rifles reversed in mourning. The tall officer stood in front. He didn't speak this time. He simply raised his hand in salute, slow and formal, the way soldiers salute a fallen enemy they finally respect. Then they dissolved. Not faded, dissolved, like ink. Washed off glass by the first real light in days. The forest went silent. Even the wind died. I dropped to my knees in the frost and puked until there was nothing left but bile and terror. The quick reaction force found me an hour later. They said I was barefoot, uniform shredded, lips blue, reciting the squad roster over and over like a broken litany. I don't remember any of it. They carried me to the aid station, pumped me full of warm fluids, wrapped me in blankets that finally felt warm. The official report was easy. Collective psychosis brought on by sleep deprivation, mold exposure, and high-altitude training stress. Barracks 3 was condemned the same day. Engineers bulldozed it before sunset, hauled the rubble away in sealed trucks, and salted the ground like the Romans did to Carthage. No investigation, no photos, no questions. Just another line item in a budget somewhere. They flew me to Landstuhl, then Ramstein, then stateside. Psych eval, medical hold, the whole script. The shrinks wanted me to admit I'd hallucinated everything. I let them think they'd won, but some things can't be buried under paperwork. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my apartment in Oceanside when the doorbell rang. A plain manila envelope, no return address. Inside were 4 sets of dog tags. Hale's, Ramirez's, Jenkins's, and mine. Mine were polished mirror bright. The others were scorched black. Edges melted like they'd been through a fire that burned colder than ice. Taped to the back of Hale's tag was a single strip of undeveloped 35mm film. I held it to the light. It showed all 4 of us standing in perfect ranks with the Shadow Army. We were wearing the long coats, the coal scuttle helmets, faces calm, eyes already empty. Behind us, the tall officer rested a hand on Hale's shoulder like a proud father. At the bottom of the frame, someone had written in neat block letters with a fountain pen. The draw was acceptable. The debt is paid in full. March when called. I burned the film, melted the tags in a coffee can with thermite I still had from an old demo kit, and scattered the ashes in the Pacific at midnight. Didn't help. Every night at exactly 0347, I wake up standing at my bedroom window, palms pressed to the glass, staring at nothing. My shadow on the wall still wears the wrong helmet. The reflection in the glass still salutes with the wrong hand. The Corps gave me a medical discharge. Full benefits, the whole thank you for your service package. They tell me I'm safe now. They're wrong, because sometimes when the moon is thin and the air tastes like wet earth and cordite, I hear boots on the hallway floor outside my apartment. Perfect interval, no breathing, just marching. And every time the tall officer's voice, quiet and patient, right behind my ear. Bereit some Abmarsch, Corporal. Ready to march. I keep my boots laced, my pack by the door, and 1 round in the chamber. When they come for good, I won't make them. Wait, because the truth is, we didn't escape the Shadow Army. We just got promoted.